Welcome to part 2 of chapter 7. This is part 2 of 3 different parts, and this one's going to be looking at bone development, deposition, and reabsorption. And this is going to be the one involved in your discussion question, where we talk about what are the different types of cells we talked about in part 1, but how do they actually deposit the bone, how do they reabsorb the bone, and then how do we remodel throughout our life? So let's get started. So ossification or osteogenesis is the process of forming bone. In the human fetus and the infant, the bone's going to develop by two different ways: intramembranous ossification and intrachondrial ossification. Both of these are going to be either flat or long bones. Both of them are going to kind of begin the same way. But both of these, we need to know the difference between the osteogenic cells with the osteoblasts and osteoclasts, and then eventually understand which ones are building, which ones are breaking down, so we're not confused when we're answering these questions on the test. So let's broken down what makes it intramembranous ossification and what makes it intrachondrial ossification. So intramembranous forms without a prior cartilage model. This is important. So no cartilage is going to be there when we're making intramembranous ossification. So these mesenchymal stem cells differentiate into osteoblasts within the embryonic or fibrous connective tissue. It's going to normally occur deeper layers of the dermis, which is great because this is below the skin. This is where, if you're building bone, you want them to form. So the bones of the skull, lower jaw, collarbone, and then those sesamoid bones like the patella. This is the way these bones, or flat bones, are going to form. First, the mesenchymal cells are going to start to cluster. They're almost going to start to form a layer. When they're starting to cluster, they're going to start to differentiate into osteoblasts. And if you remember the difference between an osteoblast and all the other ones, osteoblasts start to secrete a hardened matrix, and then that matrix becomes mineralized, and then we'll start to form the bone matrix. The bone's going to grow out in small struts. The osteoblasts eventually will become trapped in pockets. Remember, those pockets are going to be called lacuna later on, and once they're trapped into the lacuna, they're now going to be called osteocytes. When they're trapped, the stem cells are going to produce more osteoblasts and keep building up bone this way. Blood vessels are going to enter the area. They're going to meet and fuse. The blood vessels then become trapped in the developing bone. And then when you continue the deposition of the bone by the osteoblasts, they're going to enclose more blood vessels. This is going to result in spongy bone and the interwoven blood vessels within it. Then remodeling around the blood vessels produced an osteon of the compact bone. So this is those layers around the compact bone that eventually becomes the central canal. And then eventually on the outside layer, they're going to become a fibrous layer that eventually become the periosteum. So let's look at the mesenchymal cells kind of going. You have the osteoblasts that start to form around. Once they become trapped in the matrix, they're no longer osteoblasts, they become an osteocyte. And here you can see the osteocytes trapped in the matrix. You can see when they start to form around blood vessels until the blood vessels get trapped within the bone itself. And then the more they start to grow, the more those blood vessels get trapped, and eventually it becomes the periosteum on the outside, spongy bone in the middle, and then the compact bone on the outside. And this is how intramembranous ossification occurs. Another way to kind of look at it, you can see the mesenchymal cells going around. You can then see the osteoblasts. Once they get trapped by the matrix, they become an osteocyte. And here's another way to see when they grow around, that growing layer of the osteoblasts start to grow around and eventually trap the blood vessels inside, and that's what makes the spongy bone and the compact bone, and then eventually the fibrous outer layer becomes the periosteum. And this one is different because this is going to use cartilage to help guide or model the bone. So if you see any questions with cartilage, it's going to be a question about endochondral ossification. So endochondral ossification, the long bones, is mostly going to be this type of growth. The initial skeleton of embryo formed by hyaline cartilage, and hyaline cartilage gets replaced by bone. So endo means inside, chondros means cartilage. So inside using cartilage, that's the root of this word. So the steps in endochondral ossification. First, cartilage model enlarges. So you have the hyaline cartilage, and within the hyaline cartilage, you have the chondrocytes within the matrix. What happens here, the chondrocytes near the center shaft enlarge. That means it's get longer. So the chondrocytes start to die and disintegrate. Disintegration leaves cavities within the cartilage. Then blood vessels will grow around the edge of the cartilage model. The cells of the perichondrium, because it's cartilage, will then start to convert into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts start to form a superficial layer of bone along its shaft, and you can kind of see it starting to form along the shaft. When the blood vessels start to penetrate and go into the bone, this is going to entering the fibroblasts to make them differentiate into osteoblasts. And then the same thing kind of happens. The osteoblasts start to secrete the matrix. They get pushed and they get surrounded by it and become osteocytes. But here, when the spongy bone is starting to produce, it becomes the primary ossification center. So once the bone starts to form, that's the primary, or primary because it's the first part of bone growth. And then bone formation starts to spread along the shaft towards both ends. And the shaft was guided by and formed by cartilage. So in endochondral ossification, bone starts to replace the cartilage. Number 4, it continues along with remodeling. The medullary cavity is created. The osseous tissue of the shaft thickens. The cartilage near the epiphyse, or that line, is starting to be replaced by shafts of bone. The bone growth in length and then also in diameter. So it grows out and grows down. Then at this point, the epiphyses, or the ends, need to start growing. And then this becomes the secondary ossification center. The same process starts to happen here, where the blood starts to go into the second ossification center, changing into osteoblasts. The osteoblasts will then start to secrete the matrix. The epiphyses start to fill with the spongy bone, and then on the surface of this, articular cartilage remains exposed to the joint cavity, and that's why you have periosteum along the entire bone, but you have articular cartilage at the ends of the bone, so when the bones meet other bones and joints, you have articular cartilage. Between the primary and secondary, so primary growth center, and the secondary growth center, you have an epiphyseal cartilage that forms the epiphyseal plate. And this is the separation between the ends and the shaft. And then finally, the bone grows in length at the epiphyseal cartilage. The chondrocytes actively produce more cartilage on the epiphyseal side. The osteoblasts actively replace the cartilage with bone on the diaphysis side. And then the epiphyses are pushed away by continued production of new cartilage. And this is how they're continuing to grow in length during this time period. And also, when you're looking at it like this, you can see how the bones are starting to grow up and how they start to form into the shaft and the head. And also, if you hold a newborn, you can feel that their arms are very rubbery and their legs are kind of rubbery because they have a lot of cartilage between the ends of the bone and the shafts of the bone. And here is all the different processes, and there you can see the epiphyseal plate that's going to be growing up while the shaft is going to be growing up after it. And then in the adult bone, you don't see that cartilage anymore. All you see is dense, compact bone that makes up that epiphyseal line. And usually by late teens or early 20s, all the remaining cartilage in that epiphyseal plate is gone. So that's why if you wanted to see your skeletal age, you can do it at the age of 11, 12, or 13, and they can get a good idea of how tall you're going to be, because what they look at, they measure the amount of cartilage that's between the epiphysis and the diaphysis, and then once it closes, your skeletal length and your height is not going to change. And this is what the fetal skeleton looks like, and you can see all the cartilage between the different parts of the bones. And you can even see this is the femur. You can see the head of the femur is still mostly cartilage. So that secondary ossification center hasn't really started at 12 weeks. And you can see the fontanelle, the anterior fontanelle, and all the cartilage between the cranial bones. And just to repeat, ossification is that bone growth, but it doesn't stop when you turn 20. It continues throughout your entire life with growth and remodeling of bones. They're going to grow in two directions, length and width. And when they grow in length, I mentioned this, the epiphyseal plate is how bones grow in length. So once cartilage gets replaced by bone, they can no longer grow in length. And here you can kind of see, this is a child's hand where they can measure the epiphyseal plate in the wrist and then be able to determine how long those bones will grow, and they're usually pretty close within a few inches. So instead of just relying on how tall your parents are, you can get this when you're a child, and then you can kind of see how tall you're going to be when you grow up. So instead of growing in length, that's going to be called interstitial. So you don't just have to say, I'm going to get taller. We're going to talk about the interstitial growth of bones. So how long they're going to be. The bone elongation is really a result of cartilage growth within the head and then the shaft trying to catch up to it. And all of that cartilage growth is going to be in the epiphyseal plate. That's going to grow away from the shaft while the shaft is going to continue to try to catch up to it. And once the epiphysis closes, when the cartilage is gone, it'll form the epiphyseal line. And then that's when the lengthwise growth or the interstitial growth is finished. It'll occur at different ages and different bones. So some bones will still grow after 20. Some bones are done growing at the age of 15. And it also depends on sex and genetics. The other one, so now we don't want to grow in length, we want to grow in width. And this is going to be widening or thickening, and that's appositional growth. And this is going to be throughout our entire life. You might be a child, young adult, an adult, and what's happening here, you're trying to make sure your bones are going to be able to hold the weight or the stress in different activities. If you're playing football, or you're playing soccer, or you're a runner or swimmer or different types of thing, you're a weightlifter, all your bones are going to be different depending on what activity or what stresses you put on them. So what happens here in appositional growth, deposition of new bone is going to be at the surface. Osteoblasts on the deep side of the periosteum deposit osteotissue. They become trapped in the tissue. They lay down a matrix and layer parallel to the surface. These are going to form the circumferential lamella over the surface. The osteoclasts of the endostemum enlarge the marrow cavity and make it more hollow. But what's happening here, if you are a weightlifter and you use your legs a lot, you are going to have a thicker bone because it's going to be remodeled via width through appositional growth. If you're just a normal, healthy adult, what happens is you're going to have this area broken down because as an adult, you won't need to have as much thickness in the bone. You can have lighter bones when you get older. And this is what I started talking about. So bone remodeling occurs throughout your entire life, and 10% of your skeletal structure is repaired every single year. This is going to repair microfractures. Let's just say you fall off a ladder and you landed weird, and you have a small fracture in your tibia. This will repair that. It releases the minerals into the blood, reshapes the bones in response to use and disuse. So if you're using your legs more this year, your leg bones are going to be a lot stronger than they were the year before. If you start a new job, it might take you about a month to finally get used to the physical abuse to your body, or the physical use of your body, and then eventually your bones will start to remodel for that new activity. And this is all called the Wolff's Law of bone. The architecture of your individual bone is determined on the mechanical stresses placed on it, because the bones are going to adapt to withstand to those individual stresses. So everybody's bones, depending on what they're doing with their bones, are going to look a little different. All your bones are going to be roughly the same shape. Some might be thicker or wider because you might need more weight or more stresses are put on that individual bone. This is the same way if you watch Kung Fu movies, you see somebody punching a tree trunk or something like that over years, and eventually they'll build up calluses. But what they're doing is they're building up bone in their knuckles to make their knuckles a lot stronger. And this is part of Wolff's Law of bone. If you continue to put stresses on a certain bone, like if you're punching a tree, those bones that you're using to punch a tree are going to get stronger. We have two types of dwarfisms, achondroplastic dwarfism and pituitary. Pituitary is going to involve a growth hormone. Achondroplastic, the long bones stop growing in childhood. So the torso's normal, but the limbs are short. And this is going to be a failure to the cartilage from growing in the metaphysis. So what happens is the long bones just don't grow long, but the torso remains the same. Pituitary is different. All the proportions remain the same. So the torso and the limbs all remain short. Like in this case, everything looks proportional. It's just with a shorter statue because growth hormone isn't released when it needs to be released. And then a couple things to kind of remember. A mature bone is going to remain metabolically active organ. It's involved in its own maintenance and growth and remodeling throughout its entire life. It exerts a profound influence over the rest of the body by exchanging minerals with tissue fluid. It's going to be very close with blood, and it's because any type of disturbance in calcium homeostasis, calcium is very important in skeletal muscle. So if you disrupt that calcium in skeletal muscle, your muscles can't contract. You also use calcium in a lot of other organ systems, in nervous system, in muscular system. We're going to talk about that soon. So if you need calcium, you'll get it from the bone if you don't get it from your diet. And how do we get them from the bone? You can build up mineral deposition, mineralization. The crystallization process in which calcium phosphate and other ions are taken from the blood plasma and deposited into the bone tissue. You might kind of remember this. Osteoblasts are going to produce collagen fibers. Those collagen fibers are going to spiral along the length of the osteon. Those fibers then become encrusted with minerals that harden the matrix. It's that calcium phosphate that's going to be causing that hardening. And it's that hydroxyapatite from the blood plasma that's going to be deposited by those fibers. So osteoblasts produce fibers. Within the blood, the hydroxyapatite is what's going to harden the matrix. So this chemical right here is what causes your bones to become stronger. And how it does that calcium and phosphide ion concentration has to reach a critical value. And pretty much just as if you were freezing water, something needs to freeze first. It forms a crystal. So what happens is the osteoblasts are going to stop inhibitors and are going to allow these salts to start to form a crystal. Once those first few crystals form, those are called seed crystals. Once the seed crystals are there, they attract more calcium and phosphate from the solution, and these seed crystals will then start to form more seed crystals, and this is an example of positive feedback because it goes only in one direction. It's a self-amplifying cycle. It inhibits the inhibitors. It allows the salts to precipitate into a crystal. And once the first few seed crystals are attached to those fibers, more seed crystals will start to attach to those fibers, eventually hardening the bone very quickly via positive feedback loop. You can also have abnormal calcification, and this may occur in the lungs, brain, eyes, muscles, tendons, and arteries, and that's called lateral sclerosis, and this is scarring, but this is where you have calcification in parts where you don't want it to be hardened. You don't want the lungs or the brains or the eyes or muscles to harden, so this will be abnormal calcification. You can have a calculus, which is calcified mass in an otherwise soft organ such as the lung, and these are just buildups and stuff like that. There are drugs if caught early, and there might be surgical ways to remove it, but most of the time you have abnormal calcifications in the body. You need to figure out what's causing it, because even if you do surgery and take it out, it's going to be caused again, because remember, it's a seed crystal, it's a positive feedback loop, so you need to stop that feedback loop from happening. Also, another problem is mineral reabsorption, and this is the process of dissolving bone and releasing minerals into the blood. It's performed by an osteoclast at the ruffled border, and these are produced by hydrogen pumps into the membrane that secrete hydrogen into the space between the osteoclast and the bone surface, and this hydrogen into that space starts to dissolve all the minerals that make up the bone and will reabsorb those into the blood. And we'll talk about this in our next lecture. But I added osteoclast because we talked about osteoblasts and osteocytes, and this is the third one that most students kind of forget. And that concludes this micro lecture.